This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company. For more information and links to all our great podcasts, visit hartmanmedia.com.
Number one, I love your show. I love, the way that you go deep into business and then go, on some of these other tangents of experiences that as business people we all have. So thank you for putting out such good content because it's impactful. It is really impactful.
Welcome to the Creating Wealth Show with Jason Hartman. You're about to learn a new slant on investing, some exciting techniques, and fresh new approaches to the world's most historically proven asset class that will enable you to create more wealth and freedom than you ever thought possible. Jason is a genuine self-made multimillionaire who's actually been there and done it. He's a successful investor, lender, developer, and entrepreneur who's owned properties in 11 states, had hundreds of tenants, and been involved in thousands of real estate transactions. This program will help you follow in Jason's footsteps on the road to your financial independence day. You really can do it. And now, here's your host, Jason Hartman, with the complete solution for real estate investors.
Welcome to episode 2164. And if you think life is complex sometimes, well, you're right. And today we are going to talk about complexity with our guest, Peter Turchin. I think you're going to find this interview to be a fascinating one. And before we get to that, I want to remind Empowered Investor Pro members that we will be seeing you tomorrow evening for our monthly Zoom meeting. And then for everybody else who isn't a pro member, why would you be in that group? You should be a pro member. Join Empowered Investor Pro. It's fantastic. But if you are not a pro member, then join us on the second Wednesday of every month. This upcoming second Wednesday, we have CPA and Rich Dad advisor Tom Wheelwright with us. He wrote the book Tax-Free Wealth. I think that'll be a fantastic talk. You'll get some great free tax advice on our monthly Zoom meeting that is open to everyone. And you can register for that at jasonhartman.com/Wednesday, jasonhartman.com/Wednesday for our monthly free Zoom meeting. So I am in Orlando, Florida, just finishing up our collective mastermind for the past few days, our collective inner circle, I should say. We have a new name for that. Also speaking this weekend at a Rebel Capitalist event here. I hung out all weekend with Brent Johnson, did a great interview with him, with Robert Kiyosaki, Ken McElroy, George Gammon, and a whole bunch of other great people. So it was a really interesting weekend, and we've got some content for you coming up on that. I'll get the video of my talk, and I will share some of that with you on a future episode as well. So before we get to our guest today and talk about complexity, I want to talk about a property example. So here is a property we have right now that you can find right now today at jasonhartman.com. Click on the properties page. And this is in Huntsville, Alabama. I mean, what an incredible market Huntsville is. Just so much going for it. Fantastic market. And here, if you are seeing this on video, you can see the proforma taking into account all of the multidimensional aspects of real estate except one, and that is inflation-induced debt destruction. That is one thing that is a bonus on the proforma. This is left out. It's not in here. And if you've been following my work for any length of time over the past 21 years, you know that that is the fantastic hidden wealth creator in properties, inflation-induced debt destruction. You borrow the money at today's dollars, you pay it back at tomorrow's cheaper dollars. But before I came along and started talking about that great idea, it's an old acronym that you may have heard. I've talked about it before on past episodes, and that is that real estate, or specifically income property, is ideal, IDEAL, because it provides income, depreciation as a benefit, a tax benefit, depreciation, equity growth, appreciation, and leverage. And that spells ideal: income, depreciation, equity growth, appreciation, and leverage. And as a bonus, inflation-induced debt destruction. And when you look at this property that we have that you can buy now in Huntsville, I mean, it's brand new. It's only $279,000. So, I mean, how can you get brand new homes for that? Well, they're pretty hard to come by. The projected overall multi-dimensional return on investment for this property. And I know for some of you new listeners, you may think, oh, this is hype. This can't be true. It is true, folks. And that's why income property is the most historically proven wealth creator in the entire world, the most tax-favored asset class in America. And that is a projected overall conservative return here with conservative assumptions. Only 6% appreciation, 8% vacancy rate. No, we don't say it's going to be occupied 100% of the time. We're assuming 1 month per year vacancy on average. Management fee of over $100 per month. Maintenance, it's a brand new home, but we are still putting in a maintenance allowance of 2%. So overall, with all of these assumptions in here, the projected return on investment here is 29% annually. And I know you're thinking, wow, that beats the pants off the stock market. It sure does, because in the stock market, you don't have these multi-dimensional benefits like you do with income property. Be a direct investor and you get the returns. Yes, there is some more responsibility with being a direct investor, but boy, the rewards are pretty darn substantial. And here is a blow up of this proforma, but you can go see this for yourself at jasonhartman.com on the properties page, and you can look at every single number. You can pick at it. You can be a skeptic. You can do whatever you want. And also take a look at that video on the site where I go over how to read a proforma and how to evaluate a real estate deal. That's just really something every investor should just watch that short video every 6 months or so. It's free for you. Also, be sure to get the free software, the property tracker software. It's totally free. Okay. And then you can do these proformas yourself. You can change the numbers. You can change the assumptions. Just go to propertytracker.com and get yourself a free account and start using the software, and you will start to be really good at analyzing deals and determining whether or not a deal makes sense or it doesn't. You change the numbers, you run different assumptions, you see how it affects the overall return on investment. When I started doing nationwide investing 21 years ago, this is what made me a really good investor. You also standardize your data, so everything is really, really simple. You don't have to be a detective on every deal, and it'll really, really help you quite a bit. All right, so be sure to do that. And then, of course, jasonhartman.com/Wednesday for our free Wednesday Zoom meeting this month with Tom Wheelwright. That's the second Wednesday of every month. Save that date in your calendar, put it as a recurring appointment, and join us for all of those every single month because they are free and they're super valuable. So without further ado, let's get to Peter and let's discuss complexity. It is my pleasure to welcome Peter Turchin to the show. He is a complexity scientist who studies a field you may not be familiar with called Cliodynamics. And we'll get into what that means here in just a moment. He's published several books. Back in 2010, when Nature magazine asked leading scientists to provide a 10-year forecast, Peter used his models to predict that America was in a spiral of social disintegration that would lead to a breakdown of political order around 2020. It's pretty interesting how that prediction seems to have come true. And the years since have proved that his prediction is more and more accurate. So we're going to dive into a lot of interesting topics today. Peter, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the show from Connecticut, right?
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Jason. Glad to be here.
It's great to have you. So let's talk a little bit about Cliodynamics first, or being a complexity scientist. Before we started, I asked you how you would describe what you do. You know, if you're at a cocktail party, someone says, "What do you do?" Well, you say you're a complexity scientist. But more specifically, it's Cliodynamics, right?
That's correct. That's what the field, that's the new field within which I and my colleagues work now.
And so that's the study where you research cultural evolution, economic history, macro sociology, mathematical modeling, and historical processes. I mean, this is quite an area, but they are so connected. I guess the one that people might argue is not connected so much as mathematics. So maybe you want to start there. And I was reading on your website why mathematics is so important to this study. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So Cliodynamics comes from Clio, who was the muse of history, according to the Greeks. And dynamics is simply the science of change. Well, history is about how things change with time. And dynamics is essentially studying this using the mathematical models and also analysis of data. Historians, sociologists, great thinkers of the past have proposed many explanations for why things happened the way they did. So, for example, everybody knows about the collapse of the Roman Empire. One German historian collected more than 200 explanations for why the Roman Empire fell. But the problem with history has been that it has not really systematically used the scientific method. I mean, there are lots of explanations, but we don't know which explanations are good and which are bad. And the scientific approach essentially is to choose which theories work better. And how do we know that? Well, we use the method of scientific prediction, in which we extract the predictions from different theories that assume different mechanisms of decline, for example. All right, and then we compare those predictions to data. Now, the reason we need mathematics is because human societies are complex systems, right? They have many moving parts that interact in nonlinear ways, and that means that trying to understand the dynamics of human societies without mathematical apparatus is impossible. The human brain is not equipped to do that. This means that all the rival theories that explain anything about history, they need to be first translated into dynamical models, and then we can extract predictions. Then we know that predictions follow from premises, assuming you've done your math right. All right, so that's essentially the essence of Cliodynamics. It's history as science, where we translate different explanations into mathematical models, and then we test the predictions from those mathematical models using data.
Okay, so let's take the 2010 example when you made this prediction. What did you see back in 2010, and what was your prediction specifically?
Yeah, let's step back and talk about some of the broad patterns that we have seen in our analysis of historical data. Complex human societies organized as states have been around for about 5,000 years, and they can function quite well for a while, maybe 100 years or so, sometimes less, sometimes more. But inevitably, at some point, things start falling apart, and societies enter what I call end times. Why? The most common sign of approaching crisis is what we call elite overproduction. Essentially, this is when there are too many people vying for the fixed number of power positions. It's like a game of musical chairs, except you don't remove chairs as the game progresses, but you keep adding players. So you can imagine, so you start with maybe 11 players for 10 chairs, then 20 players, 30 players, 40 players, and so on. So we can talk about details, how one defines elites and how one can quantitatively study the elite dynamics. But essentially, to answer your question, what I saw back in 2010 was that United States has been developing this particular sign as well as some others. We can talk about them too. And when we put them in a model that we have constructed for the dynamics of such societies, the model indicated that these trends would eventually, within 10 years plus minus, lead to some kind of social disruption and political turbulence that we have seen many times in previous societies in our data.
So when you say elite overproduction, that's kind of an interesting phrase. Few people would argue with the concentration of wealth argument. There's a lot of that's been going on lately. Compared to history, though, it may not be that bad, but compared to recent history, it's a lot worse. Do you mean that the elites are just becoming so productive that they're able to corner markets and assets and resources, or what do you mean by that?
Not quite. Well, okay. First of all, who are the elites? Elites, defined in sociology, simply is the small proportion of people, 1-2%, who concentrate social power in their hands. So think about, yes, the proverbial 1% in the United States. That's one example. But other examples include the Mandarin class in Imperial China or medieval nobility in in France and England. So essentially, these are people who concentrate power. Now, power, you mentioned wealth. Wealth is only one source of social power, because we define four different flavors of power.
Yeah, what are those flavors? That's interesting.
Yeah. First of all, the obvious one is coercion, military power, right? When you can force people to do your will. Second one is economic power, when you can pay people to do what you want them to do. Third one is administrative and political power. Essentially, you can use the organizations to issue orders. And the final one, which is the most soft one, but also extremely powerful, is persuasion or ideological power. And so different segments of elites tend to focus on different types of power. And within our society, United States, and actually this is true for most capitalist democratic societies, the Western societies, the ruling class or the governing elite is typically a coalition between economic elites, people who have wealth, and administrative elites, people who are in positions of politicians, also bureaucrats, people like that. And in different countries, the balance of power tends to shift. But United States is fairly unusual in the extent to which the economic power dominates politics in our country. I have a whole chapter in my book, End Times, that came out about 3 weeks ago, arguing that by this point, the United States is essentially a plutocracy. It's a society governed by wealth holders.
By the way, I would agree with you, and because those wealth holders have so much other power besides their actual money, right? We can talk about lobbyists, we can talk about buying off scientists and academics all day long. I talked about that many years ago on this show after reading a Citibank report, and it made this prediction in maybe 2007 or 8 that America would become a plutocracy, and some would argue a kleptocracy. So take your pick. They're not too dissimilar, I guess. But here we are, and it's quite interesting.
Well, I would not call America a kleptocracy. The example I used in my book of a kleptocracy was Afghanistan just before the takeover by Taliban a year ago. All right, that was a kleptocratic elite. In our society, the dominance by wealth is well known and has been commented by many people, many economists, like Paul Krugman, for example, have argued that America has become a plutocracy. And there are some very good political science studies that show, for example, I'll just mention Martin Gillen's and his book, Influence and Affluence, where he shows statistically that America is a plutocracy.
Okay. All right. So where do we go with that? We're going to assume plutocracy is bad, right? Without going into that tangent.
I don't assume that something is good and bad. I'm a scientist, so I try to study this in neutral terms.
You're not making value judgment on it, but I'll say it's bad then.
It all depends. America has been governed by wealth since its inception, essentially. But at different times, American elites have been acting either more prosocially for the benefit of the whole society, or more selfishly for the benefit of themselves. And so plutocracy is not necessarily bad. It can change and does change with time.
Yep. Okay. Fair enough. So where are we going? I think, the big thing people always want to know is what's coming. What do we expect? How do we plan for it? What can we do about these forces that are shaping society and will likely continue to?
Well, the first thing
where we're going first. Where
the first thing that we need to understand is what are those forces that shape our societies. So let's go back to 2010 when I made this forecast. And let me explain a little bit what the forecast and the model which produced it was based upon. Okay. So by that point, the data showed that if you look at the last 100 years of the United States history, until roughly speaking, late 1970s, the wages of workers grew together with GDP per capita, or alternatively, thinking about it, with productivity. Many people have seen this striking graph where the wages and productivity grow together until 1970s, and then suddenly they depart, the productivity continues to increase, wages stagnate and even decline. Right. So what happens to all that extra wealth produced by this gap between wages and
it
productivity?
goes to the top, the people that own the businesses.
Exactly. It goes to the economic elites. I call it the wealth pump. It's the perverse wealth pump that started pumping riches from the poor to the rich. Now, first of all, there are three problems with that. The most obvious one is that we have conditions of popular immiseration. And this is really an absolute, in many ways, an absolute way, because the quality of life, especially as measured by biological factors, so such as life expectancy and things like that, has started to decline for the majority of the population. So that breeds a lot of popular discontent, and that is something that political entrepreneurs could harness in order to advance their careers. But that's the most obvious thing. The second problem, which is less obvious, is that we have been creating huge numbers of super wealthy. Over the past 40 years, we have the numbers of decamillionaires. These are people whose worth is $10 million or more, has increased tenfold. All right, the population grew 40%, but the number of decamillionaires increased tenfold.
And when you share that statistic, are you adjusting for inflation?
Yes.
Okay.
So this comes from Edward Wolf's, who's an economist at NYU, I believe, and he has been doing this very careful study. So he has looked at the different gradations of wealth, 10 millions, 5 millions, or 1 million, and all of them have grown quite dramatically.
Yeah, and look, I don't think anybody who's aware of what's going on would deny that we're sort of living in this like mass affluent society. But the problem is we're also living in a mass poverty society at the same time. And the middle is where it's coming from on both ends. Most of the middle moves down, a few move up. That's the problem.
Exactly. Yeah. This has been known as the hollowing out of the middle class. So now, why is it, on the face of it, having lots of wealthy people is good? Obviously, it's good for them. But why is it bad for the society? Well, many wealthy people have political ambitions. They either run themselves as candidates. You know, Donald Trump, of course, is the best known example, but Michael Bloomberg, or also failed candidates like Steve Forbes. They are all examples of this. But also they can run other candidates. So when you have too many wealthy people, the competition for political offices starts to heat up because there are now many more aspirants for those political.
Right. And it is ridiculous what they are spending to get elected. I mean, it is absurd. We can trace the cost of elections. It just keeps going up and up because it reflects this competition. It's insane. I remember many years ago when Michael Huffington ran for Senate in California, Arianna Huffington, his wife at the time. I remember hearing about the money he spent on that campaign to get what at the time was, I think, $120,000 a year job. I mean, it's just absurd. It shows you how there is so much wealth to be made working in government. Right? Because no one would spend $25 million to get elected to a $130,000 job or whatever, right? It's a complete absurdity. That can't be driven by just ego. It's more than that. It's money too. Go ahead.
So not everybody of those extra, 10 times as many wealthy, not all of them want to run for office, but as you increase the number of the pool, the number of candidates also increases. So for example, in 2016, there were 17 major candidates in the Republican presidential primaries. All right, Republican candidates in the presidential primaries. That was unprecedented at the time. Of course, in 2020, there were even more Democratic candidates. So this is why is elite overproduction bad? Because some competition for elite position is good because we want to select better people, right? But too much competition becomes corrosive. In this game of musical chairs, just imagine as the number of candidates increases fourfold over the chairs, there is so much jostling and so much temptation to start breaking rules, all right, that somebody will start breaking rules. It will inevitably deteriorate into a fist fight.
But Peter,
that's what we see in the political arena.
Sure. I'm not disagreeing with you, but the flip side of that argument is, isn't that more democratic that we have more candidates, more choices, more people have access to run for president or any other office for that matter? People don't know this, right? And I remember reading an article about it many years ago that something like 7,000 people run for president every 4 years. 7,000 people, I mean, people you never hear about, of course, right? Yeah. That never raise any money, that never get any airtime. But a lot of people run for president and every other office for that matter. Isn't that a good thing that there's more choice, more people have access to participate in government?
The problem is that it is not a good thing when there are too many people running for a fixed number of positions. And we see this. Remember, I mentioned that elite overproduction is the factor which is the common theme in all the crises. We have now close to 200 crises in our database of past societies over the past few thousand years. And elite overproduction is a ubiquitous feature leading to all of that. So too much competition is really bad. It's corrosive. And the reason is because it's human nature. Humans are not your mathematical agents in game theory that follow rules. Right? Somebody will always try to game the system and figure out how to break rules. And once that happens, the rule breaking becomes rampant and it spirals, and eventually we have violence. So this is how elite overproduction results in outbreak of violence.
Yep. And we'll be back with a lot more on this topic with this guest on our next episode. Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.